right, this is going to be the overview of Chapter 8, Drug Taking Fundamentals and Theoretical Perspectives. Let me say right up front that this chapter is really jam-packed with a lot of good information. And I'm not going to be able to cover all of it in the limited amount of time I have for lectures. So what my plan is to cover, say, the front 2/3 of the chapter more carefully. And then I'm going to ask you folks to cover the other material basically on your own. And that's going to mean the sort of the perspectives beyond the biological perspective. So we're talking about psychological and sociological and integrated ways of looking at explaining drug taking. There's just too much in this chapter, so I'm going to stick to the front end, the more fundamentals, and also the biological. So just the same advice I always give you folks: if I'm not covering material, key terms are always items to target to make sure you're familiar with those terms. And big picture, just getting when it comes to these perspectives, knowing the main ideas of how they're explaining drug-taking behavior from a psychological or sociological perspective. Just the main stories there is what I'm looking for. Okay, so let's jump into some of the fundamentals here. Number one, there are 4 principal routes through which drugs can be delivered into the body. Number 1, oral administration. 2, injection. 3, inhalation. And 4, absorption through the skin or membranes. So it's you might ask, well, why is this important in a drugs class to kind of get into the ways that drugs are taken? Well, it's important to know the basics of how all this works, and it helps give insights into why drug users take drugs in the form that they do, because there are certain advantages, there are certain reasons why they do that. It's not arbitrary and accidental. So we're going to learn a little bit more about that from this chapter. In all of the 4 delivery systems or methods, the goal is to get the drug absorbed into the bloodstream. And to get it, you want to get it absorbed as quickly as you can, and with as much intense effect as you can too. So keep that in mind as we're going through, is looking at how methods can change in terms of the speed of feeling the high and the intensity of the high. In the case of psychoactive drugs, the drug effect depends not only on reaching the bloodstream, but also on reaching the brain. So of course, your ultimate goal is not to get that drug into your bloodstream, because that's not where you're feeling it. You're feeling it in key regions of the brain. So that's our ultimate goal here in this drug administration, is getting it to the brain where it has its effect. Ingesting a drug by mouth is the oldest and easiest way of taking a drug. Oral administration and reliance upon the digestive process for delivering a drug into the bloodstream provides a degree of safety. Now, why is that? Our point here is it's safer, a little safer to be, at least the tendency is for it to be safer if you're taking drugs orally. Now, why would that be? Many naturally growing poisons taste so vile that we normally spit them out before swallowing. Others will cause us to become nauseous, causing the drug to be expelled through vomiting. So we as humans have evolved the ability to recognize poisons through a bitter, nasty taste. If you taste some sort of plant or some sort of food and it's really bitter, nasty tasting, that could be an indication that it's some sort of poison, something that is not good for your body, something toxic for your body. So it's not an arbitrary, it's not an accident that we don't like the flavors of certain things, or that certain things taste bitter to us. We've evolved that ability to recognize the nastiness of that substance, and we avoid those things. So that's one thing that helped, that if you're taking drugs by mouth, is that if it's really nasty tasting, you're probably not going to want to eat it. You're just going to taste nasty, and so you avoid taking it in that way, because you don't want that negative experience of bad flavor. Same thing with how it causes, these toxins will cause nausea, and then you throw up the drug. So you can see how it's sort of a safety feature that humans have evolved to get rid of dangerous toxic substances. Now, it's not a perfect system, but it does have some level of effectiveness. Absorption may not be complete for as long as 6 to 8 hours, so it can take a long time to absorb 100% of the drug that you've taken. There is at least a little time after accidental overdoses or suicide attempts to induce vomiting or to pump the stomach. So again, this is what the textbook is saying, is that this is one reason why there's a positive or an advantage of these orally administered drugs, is that that you do have a little bit of time to get those drugs out of the person's system before they've made it all the way to the brain and are having their effect at full power at 100%. So in this way, you may be able to prevent overdoses or death by suicide attempts, that sort of thing. When the person has taken the drugs by mouth, as opposed to the other methods that we'll talk about. The drug needs to proceed from the small intestine into the bloodstream. The membrane separating the intestinal wall from the blood capillaries is made up of 2 layers of fat molecules, making it necessary for substances to be lipid soluble. Meaning, what we mean by that is that it's that the drug is able to be transported to pass through lipids, which is fats. Or soluble in fat, so it can be like dissolved. It can move through fats to pass through and enter into the bloodstream. So again, there's certain conditions along the way for this drug to make its way to the bloodstream and then to your brain. And finally, there's the blood-brain barrier too. But let's back up just a second here. Even after successful absorption into blood capillaries, however, substances must still pass through the liver for another screening, as it were, before being released into the general circulation. See, so there's another level of filtering that goes on when these drugs are taken orally. There are enzymes in the liver that destroy a drug by metabolizing or breaking its molecular structure prior to the excretion or removal of the substance from your body. So again, it's what we're stressing here as different levels of filtering going on that can act as protections when you're using this, taking stuff by mouth, as opposed to, say, for example, injecting it directly into the bloodstream. There is, and this I mentioned just a moment ago, there's a further barrier separating the bloodstream or the circulatory system from the brain tissue called the blood-brain barrier, which determines the drug's psychoactive effects. Any drug that cannot pass through this blood-brain barrier will not have psychoactive effects. So again, another layer, another filtering part of the body, this blood-brain barrier. So you can see here that there's definitely a difference between taking these drugs orally and the other ways of delivering these drugs that we'll talk about. And let's move on to injection. Injecting the drug through a hypodermic syringe and needle is a much faster way to deliver it to the brain, because you're getting around that very slow, long, involved digestion process, which we've shown goes through several phases with different levels of screening. So this is direct to the bloodstream, which then the bloodstream quite rapidly moves to the brain. The fastest means of injection is an intravenous or IV injection, since the drug is delivered into a vein without any intermediary tissue. We'll talk about other ways of injecting drugs, but this approach, this method where it's going right into the veins, is a very quick way to deliver the effects of the drug and get the drug to the brain where you feel it, because it's bypassing everything else, getting straight to the bloodstream. An IV injection of heroin in the forearm, for example, arrives at the brain in less than 15 seconds. See, so there we're talking about, and you probably, if you're like me and you watch movies much, you can see that when people are injecting heroin, they will quickly begin to show signs that they're really feeling it. And it's a very powerful high, almost instantly. And this is called mainlining, where you're injecting it directly into the veins. It's not only rapid, but it's also extremely intense. So that's two things you have to keep in mind, that drugs vary depending on how you're taking them. They vary in how quickly you feel the drug and how intense the high is. And the more direct the method, the faster the drug gets to the brain, then the more, the sort of more intense, quicker the reward, quote unquote, of the drug is. The principal disadvantage, however, is that the effects of intravenous administration drugs are irreversible. Compare the IV drug abuse method with taking it by mouth. In the event of a mistake or unexpected reaction, bad reaction to the drug, there's no turning back. Once that drug is in the bloodstream and in the brain, the only way to turn back is if you have other drugs that can counteract that original drug, counteract the effects of the first original drug. So you have to kind of fight the drug effect with other drug effects. But you don't have these natural defenses like nasty taste that leads you to spit stuff out, or vomiting, or screening, the other sorts of screening we talked about, digestion, etc., that goes on with the oral administration. In addition, repeated injections through a particular vein may cause the vein to collapse, a common problem with IV drug users, or to develop a blood clot, which of course can cause all sorts of problems. So again, there's some strong negatives that go along with this IV injection. Now, another sort of injection is intramuscular, or IM. And in this case, the drug is delivered into a large muscle area, usually the upper arm, the thigh, or the butt. And it's absorbed into the bloodstream through the capillaries, the small little veins that supply blood to the muscles. So, this is like when you go get vaccinated, when you go get a shot at the doctor's office. A lot of times, they're going to stick you into a muscle, which is going, and then those small little capillaries are going to pick up this drug, and it slowly flows into your bloodstream and then circulates around the body. So this is a common sort of way that vaccinations is a good example of this. Intramuscular injections have a slower absorption time than intravenous injections, but they can be administered more rapidly in emergency situations because it's quick. It's just, you don't have to be precise and hit that vein just right. If you're jabbing somebody in the butt, that's a big muscle mass. You can do it quickly and not have to get the exact right spot. A third injection technique is the subcutaneous or sub-Q delivery, in which a needle is inserted into the tissue just under the skin. Okay, subcutaneous, remember that. Because the skin has a less abundant blood supply relative to a muscle, the subcutaneous injection has the slowest absorption time of all the injection methods. Okay, so this is going under the skin, and so it doesn't have it doesn't have as much blood supply, not as many capillaries. It's slower. It's a slower absorption process than when you put it into the muscle, and obviously a lot slower than when you put it directly into a vein. So it's good for slowness, right? It's best suited for a situation in which it's desirable to have a precise control over the dosage and a steady absorption into the bloodstream. So the advantage here is steady and precise, but it is slow. The skin, however, may be easily irritated by this procedure. As a result, only relatively small amounts of a drug can be injected under the skin, compared with the quantity that can be injected into a muscle or directly into a vein. When involved in drug abuse, subcutaneous, again under the skin, injections are often referred to as skin popping. All injections require a needle to pierce the skin, so there's a risk of infection if the needle is not sterile. We saw when we looked at the global data that this is the most common way that people die in drug-related behavior. Is not from overdoses, is not the number one cause. It's through the spread of disease, whether that be hepatitis C or HIV virus, etc., that this is actually the biggest killer when we're talking about drugs around the world. This practice of injecting heroin or cocaine with shared needles, for example, dirty needles, right? Contaminated needles promotes the spread of infectious hepatitis and HIV. Once again, to stress what a big killer that is. If administered orally, drugs do not have to be any more sterile than the foods we eat or the water we drink. So again, sterility, being sterile, being clean, is kind of more of an issue with injections than it is by mouth, because a mouth, again, the digestive system can kind of handle a little bit of contamination. Again, maybe sometimes the food we eat or water that we drink may not be perfect, but you can get away with it not being perfect a lot of the time. Next to ingesting a drug by mouth, the simplest way of receiving its effects is to inhale it in some form of gaseous or vaporous state. The alveoli within the lungs can be imagined as a huge surface area with blood vessels lying immediately behind it. Our bodies are so dependent on the oxygen in the air we breathe that we have evolved an extremely efficient system for getting oxygen to its destinations. So again, the lungs inhalation is a very effective way to deliver drugs into the bloodstream and to the brain. As a consequence of this highly developed system, the psychoactive effect of an inhaled drug is even faster than a drug delivered through the intravenous injections. That might surprise you based on the kind of physiology of this. You would expect that the intravenous injection would have the fastest effect. But traveling from the lungs to the brain takes only 5 to 8 seconds. It's that efficient and delivers it that quickly. So this is one reason why inhalation is such a common method to deliver drugs to the brain. One way of delivering a drug through inhalation, common way, is to burn it and breathe the smoke-borne particles in the air. The most obvious common example of this is smoking cigarettes, which is around the world is extremely common behavior, type of drug taking behavior, been around for a long time. This delivers nicotine to the brain very rapidly. Drugs administered through smoking include nicotine from cigarettes, opium, tetrahydrocannabinol or THC, that's the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana, freebase cocaine, crack cocaine, and crystallized forms of methamphetamines. Drugs such as paint thinners, gasoline, and glues can be inhaled because they evaporate easily and the vapors travel freely through the air. So again, a similar sort of method here. In medical settings, drugs that produce general anesthesia are administered through inhalation since the concentration of the drug can be precisely controlled. Now that's true in a medical setting, maybe not necessarily in all cases with illegal drugs. But again, I want to stress the sort of powerful nature of this type of drug administration. And one of the reasons why you see it a lot because it's delivering the effect very quickly. The principal disadvantage of inhaling smoke drugs arises from the long-term hazards of breathing particles in the air that contain not only the active drug itself, but also the other contaminants that are that you're smoking, that you're drawing into your body. Tar, for example, in the case of smoking cigarettes. There's, if you just think of it from a common sense point of view, if you're breathing smoke into your lungs, that's not going to be good for you long term. You would expect that even without any scientific evidence behind you. Now let's see, I think I'm like 19 minutes into this one. So let me take a break and we'll finish up the different ways that this is administered. These drugs are administered in the next section.